think, second last instalment in our People Policy and Place seminar series. We've all been really looking forward to this one, and you would be really well attended. It's fantastic. So let me welcome everyone in the room and also everyone online. In case you don't know, my name is Kim Humphrey. I'm Director of the Northern Institute here at CBU. And before we go any further, let me acknowledge that we are on the unceded lands of the Larrakia Nation, and I pay our respects to Larrakia elders, past, present, and rising, thanks for me, and acknowledge their continuing custodianship for lands and seas and knowledges, cultures, and communities. And I extend that acknowledgement to the Wiradjuri people, and to all First Nations people here today or online. Let me just start off by saying a little bit about our speaker today, Kellie Pollard. Dr. Kellie Pollard. Kellie is a research fellow here at the Institute. She's been with us and with the Faculty of Arts and Society for quite some time. She is one of Australia's leading and very few Indigenous archaeologists, and has published very widely in this field, is very respected in this field, so much so that she is in fact on, I think, a second term on the Australian Research Council College of Experts, and she advises on the funding of Indigenous research across the country in that city. Kellie's interests are pretty broad. They include, or they range from Indigenous epistemologies and methodologies to Indigenous and historical archaeology to truth-telling and treating. And I think if you read her work, you can see all of those things and more embodied in that work, and I'm sure it will be embodied in what you're going to say today, Kellie. So this morning, Kellie, as you can see, is going to talk to us about Aboriginal and archaeological responses to the European invasion of Darwin, focusing in particular on the long history, including contemporary history, of fringe camps, and examining the ways in which this has been a form of relationality between the colonial and Aboriginal ontological frameworks, and has been a form of Aboriginal resistance. So I'm going to shut up at this point. I'm going to come back after Kellie has delivered her stuff, and we'll have, I'm sure, lots of questions from the floor and online. If you do have questions online as things go along, just put them in the chat and we'll bring them up towards the end of the talk. So, without further ado, Kellie, come up to the podium and I'll be back soon.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kim. And thank you, everybody, for coming, the people in the room and people online. I want to begin, of course, by saying that in this presentation, I discussed the results of a PhD study I undertook into the significance to Aboriginal people of the European invasion of the Darwin region in 1869 until as recently as 2018. I decided to do a study like this for many reasons, but foremost is because there are many texts on the history of Darwin from a non-Indigenous point of view, and I thought there needed to be an account that attempted to balance the role of truth-telling about this history. Because how many texts about invasion history in Australia are there that give a perspective on it from the point of view of Aboriginal people? So this was a powerful motivating reason for me to do the study. Next, please. So this is the slide of the Larrakia flag, which you may see flying during NAIDOC week, especially at the Larrakia Nation. And so I want to begin by also paying my respects to the Larrakia people, because I feel honoured that they allowed me to study how their ancestors survived and negotiated the European invasion of their country. And I worked with Larrakia people during the 2010s when I was doing my PhD, and I had the support of consecutive boards of directors of the Larrakia Nation over 5 years to do this study. So I pay my respects to them, and I hope that I can do homage to their ancestors in this presentation. On the point of truth-telling, the results discussed in this presentation bear directly on the right of Darwinians and Territorians at large to know the city and the greater metropolitan area came to be established during the zenith of 19th century social Darwinism and 19th and 20th century European colonialism after the European invasion in 1869. And when it comes to truth-telling history and present, a study like this contributes to national topical debates about the relationship and relations between Indigenous people and other Australians, especially now, more than ever, because of the results of the recent national referendum in 2023, rejecting an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Truth-telling histories that privilege the voices of Indigenous people on the impacts of the European invasion of our continent in 1788 are needed more than ever before in Australia, because as we have seen from analyses of the referendum result, Australians seem unable to make a connection between disadvantage of Indigenous people in society today and the causative origins of that disadvantage. Beginning as it does with European colonisation and colonialism, and continuing through time to the present. Next, please, Nani. No, it should be the one before that. Yep. It's why in this presentation today, I hope I can show how in the Darwin region, the invasion directly impacted the ancestors of the Larrakia people. That isn't to say that the descendants of Larrakia ancestors are not still impacted by European colonisation and colonialism, because it stands to reason that all Aboriginal people in Australia are still negotiating its impacts in all sorts of ways. But in this study, I paid close attention to how Larrakia ancestors negotiated the new reality of Europeans arriving and staying on their country. A reality that would go on to perpetuate a legacy for their descendants to have to navigate. The Larrakia people and their close neighbours, the Woolna Aboriginal people, who have known each other for millennia prior to the invasion and after the invasion, sometimes acted together in unison and sometimes apart, in gaining knowledge and experience of the Europeans to try and understand why they had come, what their intentions were, and how long they might stay. Next. For this study on how the Larrakia survived the invasion, I used definitions of colonialism that resonated with evidence I found in the archives and the archaeological record, suggestive of the state of relations between the invaders and the Larrakia people, as well as other Aboriginal people. In literature, while there's no agreement on one single definition of colonialism, some debaters argue colonialism is not about dominance per se, and claim instead that it's about producing relations of dominance to produce social orders. This view of colonialism is concerned with issues of power, land theft, and dispossession of Indigenous people. In this view, it's also preoccupied with ideological constructions of race and class inequality, and colonialism refuses to accept values other than its own. Next. Another view in literature describes colonialism to be the domination imposed by a foreign minority, racially and culturally different, acting in the name of a racial and cultural superiority, dogmatically affirmed, and imposing itself on an Indigenous population constituting a numerical majority but thought of as inferior to the dominant group from a material point of view. Yet another view of it seems to augment that description of colonialism by arguing it's about a relationship of domination between an Indigenous people and a minority of foreign invaders. In this view, the fundamental decisions affecting the lives of the people who have been colonised are made and implemented by the colonial rulers in pursuit of interests that are often defined in a distant metropolis. Next. And I take the view on colonialism described by Patrick Wolf as having at its core motives that are relentless in its agenda, such as the land itself, rather than the surplus value to be derived from mixing native labour with it. Though in practice, Indigenous labour is at base a winner-takes-all project whose dominant feature is not exploitation but replacement. The logic of this project, a sustained institutional tendency to eliminate the Indigenous population, informs a range of historical practices that otherwise appear distinct. Invasion is a structure, not an event. Next. For my study in the Darwin region, I accepted these conceptualizations of colonialism. So, reflecting on the lack of one single definition of colonialism and reflecting on the historical process of land dispossession outlined in a theoretical model of the European invasion in the Darwin region, which I will show you shortly. In the study of European invasion, I contributed my own definition of colonialism to mean the historical process extending from the first contact to the present, through which Indigenous lands were invaded and stolen by Europeans whose intent was and remains to make profit from these lands. Next. Now, starting at the beginning, the permanent European invasion of the Darwin region began with George W. Goyder in 1869. Goyder was a government-paid land surveyor living in South Australia, where he was tasked by the South Australian government to mount an expedition to Northern Australia and establish a place from which Europeans could trade and do commerce with other European and international countries. But he was also tasked to locate a place to settle with the intent to colonise and establish a new northern capital of Australia. Much of this aspect of the history of Europeans in the Darwin region has been written about extensively by professional and lay historians. My intention today is to discuss how the ancestors of the Larrakia people reacted to the invasion and how Aboriginal people from other regions of the Northern Territory reacted to the longer-term European colonisation of the Darwin region. So to understand this, I built a theoretical model with a timeline to illustrate the central importance of the land question, specifically the dispossession of Larrakia people and consequent possession of land by Europeans to build the greater metropolitan area that is now the Darwin region. The possession of land is crucial to the project of colonialism for the structure of society in countries where Indigenous populations were overtaken by force wherever Western European Empire diaspora conquered. In the 19th century, those countries with a European colonialism history comparable to Australia's, the possession of land was the prominent objective, and the labour of Indigenous populations in establishing that objective was vitally important to the success of the invading forces, especially in the early years. In the model, you can see I have segmented the process of land takeover by Europeans after the invasion in 1869 until recently. We can see that in 1869, the land was the sovereign possession of the Larrakia people. When Goyder set ashore, rather than threaten him and his crew to return to their ship and cast off, archive evidence suggests, including Goyder's diary, that the Larrakia allowed them to come ashore and within a short time establish their camp infrastructure. I theorised the stage of contact between the two sides in the model as Aboriginal accommodation engagement. Engagement because archive evidence suggests that there was mutual curiosity on both sides. Despite Goyder Goya ordering his crew not to interact with Aboriginal people at all, the crew did in fact barter and exchange goods and objects with Larrakia people whenever the opportunity arose. Throughout the 1870s into the 1880s, the model depicts a time of established cohabitation, beginning in the original base camp from which Goya and the crew of the ship the Munta had arrived, and which rapidly expanded such that with the arrival of more ships' passengers, the foreign population threatened to overwhelm the Larrakia population, as well as the threshold of carrying capacity of the natural resources on country, to withstand a population with different beliefs about economy of exploitation. The cohabitation time in the model depicts the pressure on the sovereignty of land ownership by the Larrakia in resisting the takeover of their lands by the invaders. In the early part of the cohabitation stage, through the, although by the early part of the cohabitation space, the process of land dispossession is underway. From the 1870s, the model depicts how the process of land dispossession started to tilt more towards the possession of the invaders, such that in the ways the relations between the Larrakia and by now other Aboriginal people who had come into the region from elsewhere in the Northern Territory changed in favour of the survival of the invaders at the expense of the livelihoods of Aboriginal people. This came about because the invaders, both in terms of population number and in the extent of the earthworks around the original base camp Goida established, extended into the bush in all directions, changing to be primarily in their possession. In this stage of the model, the Larrakia are becoming a minority and less sought after for labour or other services by Europeans. This lessened their bargaining powers and increased their vulnerability to land takeover. While to some extent in the cohabitation stage, Larrakia people were still accommodating and engaging with the outsiders and on their terms wherever possible, they were in competition with newly arrived foreigners to bargain for opportunities. In the model, I called this new reality the state of survivance for Larrakia people. You can see that the state of survivance in the model is bigger than the other stages depicted, and this is because of crucial archive documentary evidence suggesting that Larrakia people were now in the depths of fighting to retain control of land at the same time as fighting for their right to live within the same spaces the invaders had taken for their exclusive use. This forced Aboriginal people to continually move their camps and materials they made that they were surviving on. The transition from co-inhabited land to non-Aboriginal control of land to the right of both to occupy and use the land, what I called contested space in the model, depicts this now opposition to each other's presence. Once the onset of contested opposition to each other gained pace, the Larrakia faced the dedicated and organised strategy by Europeans to take possession of their land and control their access to their country and its natural resources. It was the beginning of the resilience of survivance for the Larrakia. I now want to summarily present the archive evidence, the archaeological evidence, and the ethnographic evidence, supportive of this outlined background, defining the meaning and purpose of colonialism as it applies to the land dispossession of the Larrakia people in the Darwin region. I studied archive documentary evidence from the Northern Territory, New South Wales and South Australia. I studied documents produced after 1869 in Darwin by non-Aboriginal people, documents like the diaries and letters of members who were part of the original team under Goida's command of the ship of the Munta, who established the original base camp in 1869. Dated to the 1870s, I studied the handwritten diaries and journals of people and amateur ethnohistorians. I also selected a sample of colonial era newspaper printed editions containing articles and editorials, accounts by travellers or government records produced for officialdom. Sources produced by missionaries, settler citizens, settler officials, colonial politicians, and colonial media organisations. Thank you, Lani. And the diaries of the anthropologist and colonial official in the Darwin region, Baldwin Spencer. The colonial era sources were written by non-Aboriginal people for non-Aboriginal people, which means these kinds of records were produced to serve the interests of non-Aboriginal people. It was hard, indeed it was rare, to come across words in archives evidence from Aboriginal people about the impacts of the invasion on their lives. It was also relatively rare to come across written advocacy by officials about the impacts of the invasion and that he was having on the health and well-being on Aboriginal people. Okay. And I noted that readers were apt to respond about the topic of Aboriginal people in terms evocative of racist sentiment and social Darwinism discourse. All these sources revealed the living conditions and material culture of the Larrakia people and other Aboriginal people living in fringe camps in the vicinity of the colonial settlement during this period of transition in the invasion history. The kind of information I selected from newspaper articles was about decisions, commentary, views or opinions expressed about events in the colonial settlement involving Aboriginal people, and decisions, commentary, views or opinions about policy in the colonial settlement pertaining to Aboriginal people by South Australian-based politicians and citizens, or by the Northern Territory Office of the Government resident in Darwin, other colonial officials or media editors in the settlement or in South Australia. I also studied legislation that was debated and enacted by the South Australian Parliament pertaining to the relationship between non-Aboriginal people and Aboriginal people in the colonial settlement. Newspaper reports in South Australia and later in Darwin about the progress of the colonial settlement were prominent in the 1880s and 1890s in the lead up to the removal of Larrakia people from within the boundaries of the colonial settlement after 1910 and forced to live in the Carlin compound, which was the beginning of their long experience of being wholly dispossessed of their country until the 1950s and 60s. All of the archive evidence was examined to first determine the emerging thematic concerns of the invaders, such as issues related to their own survival and longevity. Second, to determine the composition of the Aboriginal communities within the borders of the settlement and later on the fringes of it. Third, determine the documentation about specific behaviours of Aboriginal people in the settlement. Fourth, determine the evidence for changing availability of natural resources as a subsistence source to the settlement. And finally, to gain insights into the behaviours of both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people over time, depicted in the theoretical model as accommodation and engagement, cohabitation and survivance and transgression. For the archaeological evidence, the rural town of Southport is approximately 75 kilometres south of Darwin. Southport, which in 1869 was uncleared bush, and in the present is the partially cleared bush of the small rural community of mostly non-Aboriginal people who live there. There were 4 discrete large areas that were surveyed by what archaeologists call a pedestrian transect method, which is where people form a straight line and walk together in one direction over a defined area of ground to locate artefacts. In Boyer's 1869 original survey plan of Southport, it provided a view of the areas of land he named Mara Square, an area of land he called South Terrace, an area of land he zoned for the original historic cemetery, dating to the earliest contact period, which contains the original graves of Europeans and Chinese people, and an area zoned in recent times for conservation purposes. Google Earth maps of Southport show how little a significant proportion of Southport had changed since Boyer's original map of the area. The archaeological evidence was all the artefacts that were manufactured by Aboriginal people on white quartz stone at Southport, or Aboriginal tools made on glass bottle and possibly metal that were introduced to Southport by Europeans and Chinese people, originally manufactured by them in their home countries and brought to Southport after the invasion. During archaeological surveys, we found most of this archaeological evidence at least, at two large sites on the periphery of the Southport town grid. So I just want to point out to you here, I haven't written much on the slides, that for these two slides, these are artefacts, these are Aboriginal made artefacts of tools in the same form that they would have been made on stone. And we did find evidence of stone artefacts at Southport, what we call flakes, in different stages of modification. And these are, that's a scraping tool on the far right, and that's what we call a core. That's the bottom of a historic bottle, which Aboriginal people broke down and napped to make other artefacts come off it. During our pedestrian transact surveys across the length and breadth of each of the 4 areas of the town grid delineated in Goyde's map, the archaeological evidence of stone tools pre-European invasion and the archaeological evidence of Aboriginal made tools made on manufactured bottle glass after the European invasion established the continuity of Aboriginal traditional tool forms that spanned the invasion period between the two cultures, and this evidence established their spatial relationship to each other across Southport. This evidence is dated to the accommodation and engagement time in the model. Now I turn to the ethnographic evidence to support the aspects of resistance and transgression I theorised in the model. In the model's timeline from the 2000s, you can see the stage of Aboriginal people's resistance to being invaded is transitional and it's morphed into transgression. For example, illegally camping in the long grass against the Darwin City Council policy, which is where it was at in 2018, that transgression, when I did the surveys. In 2024, Aboriginal behaviour is still transgression, and the evidence is in the continuation of Aboriginal people defying colonialism to make camps on the fringes of mainstream society in the Northern Territory, or the long grass. I studied the material evidence of Aboriginal behaviour in the long grass, all the remains of objects that were either left behind at abandoned fringe camps or all the objects that were still being used in fringe camps at the time I did the site recording in 2018. I surveyed Aboriginal camps in Darwin's inner suburbs and in its rural area over 3 dry seasons with staff from the Larrakia Nation Aboriginal Corporation. The dry season burn-off regime in the long grass helped to make the places where Aboriginal people were camping in the long grass visible for site recording. And when we came across a long grass camp, I made a point of only taking photographs of what was present without touching anything, or after, of course, if people were home, permission was given to do so. Together, the archive evidence and the archaeological evidence support the different stages of the negotiation or transition by Larrakia people. Tentatively at first, the increasingly complex enmeshing of relations between the Larrakia people and the invaders over time within the struggle for possession of land and control was central to how the stage in the model of accommodation and engagement was eventually replaced with vying to co-inhabit the contested spaces in the colonial settlement and the emergence of Aboriginal opposition to the invaders. This model depicts that the transition of Larrakia people accommodating and engaging the invaders evolves gradually, not suddenly or abruptly, but inevitably into resistance towards the invaders and transgression of the invaders' terms of being allowed to be on country. This brings me to the next model I used in the study, which I used to analyse Aboriginal behaviour in the long grass, a theoretical framework by the philosophers Hollander and Einwohner. Specifically, their review in scholarship on the nature and substance of resistance behaviour in diverse social contexts. Pollard and Einwohner identified 8 separate types of resistance, which I used 4 to interpret Aboriginal behaviour at camps in the long grass, depicted as resistance and transgression in the theoretical model. In the framework of Hollander and Einwohner, behaviour is broken down to represent categories they called overt resistance, covert resistance, mixed resistance, and attempted resistance. These categories address 2 questions I wanted to answer. First, did the ethnographic evidence of abandoned Aboriginal camps and objects at camps in the long grass fit with any of these categories? And if so, which of the categories of behaviour is recognised as such by other people in Darwin? Second, whether Aboriginal people and their materials at camps in the long grass are an expression of the continuity of resistance outlined in the model dating to the 1950s and 60s, to the point of being transgressive of contemporary mainstream culture in Darwin. Starting with Hollander and Einwohner's categories of resistance, they define overt resistance as behaviour that is visible and readily recognised in society by both the targets, that is the people themselves, the people in the long grass, of interest, and third-party observers, people outside the citizenry. Hollander and Einwohner argue overt resistance behaviour is intentional and ought to be recognised as such. They argue that on a spectrum of behaviour, overt resistance can include collective acts like social movements and even revolutions, or can be individual acts of refusal, and they give the example of women resisting doing domestic work as overt resistance. No material evidence of overt resistance was found in the long grass in Darwin, but the question is why? I argue the answer relates to the levels of racism and discrimination that Aboriginal people endure daily in the Northern Territory. In a variety of circumstances, where Aboriginal people are simply living their lives. I argue that Aboriginal people prefer not to attract unwanted attention from authorities. On the contrary, what is perceivable are acts of racism imposed on Aboriginal people daily by authorities and by citizens in Darwin society that meet the definition of overt resistance. Next, they define covert resistance as acts that are intentional yet go unnoticed and therefore unpunished by the targets. Although they are recognised as resistance by other culturally aware observers, and they give the example of acts of avoidance of a particular individual or self-imposed exile from a particular context, material evidence of covert resistance in the study included virtually all the remains left behind in the long grass, such as food scrap littering, sleeping paraphernalia, cooking paraphernalia, eating in the long grass, possessing a diverse range of material personal items, materials to make shelter with, evidence of transport, smoking, entertaining in the long grass, health-related self-care, personal hygiene and toileting in the long grass, and clothes and accessories for wearing. Next, they defined mixed resistance as an act of behaviour recognised by the targets themselves, but is behaviour that goes unrecognised by third-party observers. Such acts may be missed if, for example, they take place in settings that are known and accessible to the targets, but are inaccessible to third-party observers like secret societies. Material evidence of mixed evidence resistance in this study is the evidence of alcohol consumption and the paraphernalia for drug use in the long grass. This is overt resistance when undertaken in a public area. However, this is not always the case because some sites are chosen for privacy to consume alcohol or drugs. Next, they define attempted resistance as a person's intentional act going unnoticed by both targets and observers alike. In the long grass, the evidence of attempted resistance is Aboriginal people drinking alcohol in public places when they choose to, in spite of laws that prohibit this. For this reason, I add that Aboriginal attempted resistance has political ramifications because it defines drinking bans in public places. But I also see this form of resistance as Aboriginal agency of personal autonomy on land that is controlled by non-Aboriginal people. This category of resistance is also reminiscent of transgression. Evidence for attempted resistance in this study was toileting or having sex in the long grass in the form of disposed toilet paper, human feces, and discarded condoms. Toileting evidence in the long grass was found at 2 sites, and while used discarded condoms were seen in the long grass, they did not occur in all the camps reported in the study. Hence, the material evidence of attempted resistance in the long grass exists, but it is not as widespread as the material evidence for the other demonstrations of resistance illustrated by material remains. So what evidence in the long grass supports Aboriginal resistance behaviour becoming transgressive? In literature, transgression has been described as actions which cross boundaries or violate limits. Faust argues that transgressions which are permitted or escape the notice of boundary policing authorities push the boundaries further. This appears to be what is happening in the long grass, where a combination of being noticed and escaping notice limits and enables Aboriginal agency to transgress boundaries. And as in the long grass, when Aboriginal people are perceived to be violating society's predominant values, such behaviour is met with reactions that exist on a similar spectrum to that also described by Faust, which is that transgressions are indiscretions that incur various reactions from the mildly normative passers-by to the brutally disciplining or violent arrest. Transgressive actions incite reactions due to their relationship to norms. Transgressions violate unspoken or explicit rules that maintain a particular social order. Aboriginal agency in the long grass is not an organised social movement of resistance. However, Aboriginal agency in the long grass has features that align it with what Faust argues is what transgression represents, and that it is a distinct form of resistance. In summary, I've presented documentary historical evidence from archives in Australia, archaeological evidence from Southport in the Darwin rural area, and ethnographic evidence of Aboriginal people in contemporary society making camps in the long grass in Darwin. These 3 very different types of evidence provide us with a new way of thinking about how Larrakia people, after the 1869 European invasion, when they had full sovereignty over their land, up until they were forcibly removed from country and made to live in punitive residential conditions from 1910 until at least the 1950s, bequeathed survivance to their descendants. The historical process of land dispossession of the Larrakia people was achieved through the piecemeal process of territorial expansion by the Europeans and other nationalities once the original colony established by Pollard was no longer confined to the harbour area and spread inland to Southport by the early 1870s. I discussed how in the mid to late 19th century, the unconstrained growth of the invader population eventually led to overt hostility towards the presence of Larrakia and other Aboriginal people in the colony, manifesting as intolerance of them in racist terms and social Darwinist discourses. The anthropologist Baldwin Spencer was the architect of the removal from country of the Larrakia on behalf of the state in the early 20th century, but although confined under strict conditions, the Larrakia resilience of survivance, as depicted in the model, continued in the memorialising of their kinship and connection to country until their release began in the 50s and 60s. Within the model I argued that despite the efforts of Europeans to eradicate Aboriginal people from within the colony by the mid to late 19th century and assume total control of the land, Aboriginal people did and continue to maintain their presence on country. In Territorian society today, Aboriginal resilience of survivance takes material expression in the long grass camps of different types of resistance, to punitive and discriminatory punishment in contemporary policy. In Territorian society today, Larrakia resilience of survivance takes expression much like it did in the early 20th century as celebrations of culture, language and history, despite the forces of colonialism then and now. In the genre of truth-telling that is occurring in Australia, the history I briefly outlined in this presentation closes a gap in the knowledge about the history of Aboriginal people in Darwin after the European invasion from another perspective. Truth listening the legacies of invasion history of our continent is a moral responsibility of all Australians if the quest of Australia coming to terms with the past is to be realised. So thank you for listening, and I invite questions.
Thank you, Kellie. That was brilliant, and I want you to go on talking, but I forgot we've got to give way to questions, haven't we? So please, questions or comments?
And also, I think there's some people online. You might want to put some.
Yeah, maybe in the chat. Let's start from the chat.
Just a couple of comments, I suppose. Thank you. It occurs to me sort of ontologically that the people on the disadvantaged people are the ones that are on the fringe camp. So when the white invaders came, they were in a camp. They were on the fringe, but they very quickly had the objective of taking over the main action, and then the position became reversed. So that the land that was once Larrakia Nation now become, and now I'm thinking, where's Larrakia Nation now? You know, does it only exist within the fringe camps in long grass around Darwin and other places?
Well, I can say on behalf of Larrakia, I hope I may, that the Larrakia people are a thriving people, a thriving community in Darwin society, despite their ancestors' experiences of the invasion. And it's interesting to know that in the long grass, the camps that are made in the long grass are mainly Aboriginal people from remote communities who have come into Darwin.
As I've noticed.
And the thing is that that tradition dates back to the earliest years of colony, when it attracted Aboriginal people from across the Northern Territory. And they came in and they made camps around the colony. And Larrakia had a real sort of job on their hands trying to keep the Aboriginal people who are coming from remote communities under control, in the sense of not overrunning the colony and also not sort of undercutting Larrakia access to opportunities with Europeans. So in a sense, Aboriginal fringe camps have been there right since the beginning of the invasion, with the same descendants, people from remote communities. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Very clear and systematic. Really appreciate it. My name is Mikey. I'm a PhD student at Menzies School of Health Research, looking at education equity, pathways for young people. I was just wondering how you went about selecting the written colonial evidence to answer your question.
Yeah. So we talk about doing 100% at first. When you're reading literature for a PhD, you just sort of you examine everything that you think might be relevant to the research questions that you're trying to answer. And this is a historical project. It was a historical archaeology project, so I knew I had to look at anything and everything that had been written about the invasion since Goyder. And Goyder, he referred to it as an invasion in his diary. So I knew that I had to look at records like the very first Europeans who came, so the crew of the ship, the Monta. I knew I had to look at the sorts of records that the newly established government officials in the colony had were making about what was going on in the colony. And then I sort of expanded to looking at journals, diary entries, this kind of thing, of ship's passengers that were coming. And, you know, with the arrival of ship after ship after ship, the Larrakia, I suspect, started to regret not having decided what to do about the Europeans when they first landed, because they were just becoming overwhelmed with the invader population. So I looked at the diaries and the writings of people who came on the ships. And then, of course, once the colonial media was established, I just read through a selection of the colonial newspapers that are available on Trove. Not every edition is available on Trove, so that affected the selection process as well. But I just had a look through to see what the media was saying about how it was progressing the colony, what was going on in the colony, who was doing what. And, you know, what I noticed with the colonial media over time is that it became more and more punitively and racist in its depictions of Aboriginal people in the colony. And like I said at the opening, you know, when Goyder arrived, and then with him the inflow of colonialism was at its zenith at that time. And so, you know, Europeans had, you know, fairly established ideological opinions about non-Europeans, non-Westerners, non-white people, and, you know, Indigenous people.
And methodologically, did you have to account for what you selected and what you didn't select?
I didn't do it numeric like that. I just did a random survey, because there are many hundreds and hundreds of editions of the colonial newspapers. So I just kind of selected the earliest ones for the 1870s, which is the earliest time of the colonial period, and then a random selection across time. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
There's a couple of, well, first just acknowledging Susan Lewis, the comment up there. Susan, your comment is on the screen so people can see it. There's a question from Terry Pollard. What was the involvement of Archaeological in research?
Oh, thank you for the question, Terry. The Larrakia Nation worked very closely with me. I was working for the Larrakia Nation as a research associate of kinds at the time when I was doing my honours degree. And when I went on to do a PhD, I talked with the Larrakia about the project, and I had to put an argument position to the board of directors at the time and the CEO of the Larrakia Nation Aboriginal Corporation, and they accepted it. And so then I went into a formal agreement with the membership of the Larrakia Nation in the form of a MOU between myself and at CDU. Well, at Flinders, I was a student at Flinders studying long distance, and the Larrakia Nation. And in the terms of that agreement, it set out how I was to do the research with Larrakia and for Larrakia, and who would accompany me when I was doing research on the country. So the Larrakia board, several years, so it took me 5 years, five years of consecutive board of directors supported the research, because I checked in with them each year. Thanks.
Thank you. And also one from Bart. Hi, Bart. Bart Stanford's asking he's interested in the forms of resistance, how they are shaped and manifested today. Do you have insights into political resistance in the form of non-participation in democratic processes? Indigenous voting seems to be declining in the NC, and Bart's interested in how and why that is, and what, if any, existing colonial structures impact Indigenous.
Thanks, Bart. I mean, I think they're two different questions. In the terms of the forms of resistance and how they manifest today, my thesis is that Aboriginal behaviour in long grass camps in Darwin is the ultimate expression of resistance to the mainstream norms and values of the dominant society. And it's now evolved to the point of transgression. I mean, people in the long grass understand that if they drink and do all the other activities that Darwin City Council laws make illegal, they know they're going to get fined if they get caught. They know that if after so many times of being fined, they could be imprisoned, this kind of thing. So they understand the punitive consequences if they get caught, showing their resistance in the way that they choose to live and socialise in the long grass. And that is a form of resistance. I think because it's mainly non-Aboriginal people who occupy the long grass camps, Aboriginal people from remote communities, not the Larrakia. I'm not sure that the form of resistance it's the same for the Larrakia. I mean, obviously the continuity of things like cultural festivals, corroborees, speaking in language, doing all of the things that weren't allowed or discouraged by the Europeans in the colony, is also a form of contemporary resistance by the Larrakia. And the fact of their survival is a form of resistance, actually. As to the second part of the question, political resistance in democratic processes, I think that goes to more like say for the vote, the referendum vote, and what we know about elections when they come around. We know something like Aboriginal people from remote communities really struggle to understand, the democratic process of voting, casting a vote, and because they don't speak English as a first language, they struggle to comprehend the arguments and the issues that the politicians put out there. I'm not sure yet, because I haven't looked back, what the AEC is doing, but it should be doing things like, writing information pamphlets about how to vote, where to vote, when, who you want to choose, this kind of thing, in languages other than English, because right there is a barrier to the full participation in the democratic process if people don't speak English as a first language or as a preferred language.
Great. And there's a question from Jess around how can the research be strategized in terms of evidence that leads to treaty?
It's a good question. Colonial jurisprudence to lead to treaty. Well, I think you could extend the argument of colonial jurisprudence to the contemporary period because, anyone who's an Australian, born and raised and bred in Australia, anyone who's knowledgeable about Indigenous Australia knows that colonial laws after the invasion period and now are punitive and targeted at Aboriginal people. I mean, how else do we understand why the incarceration rates of Indigenous people across Australia are as bad as what they are? How else do we explain laws written specifically to target Aboriginal people, like the intervention, this kind of thing? I suspect the politicians would, not be sympathetic to this kind of research. I mean, they're more interested in Darwin in supporting government programs which are taxpayer funded to literally on a daily basis go into the long grass and harass Aboriginal people to move on from camps. And so Aboriginal people are continually, if you like, being moved on until they reach another destination somewhere in the long grass, and then the authorities like to do this kind of thing at about 4 o'clock in the morning when people are asleep to make the worst kind of impacts of that. And so I think there's already an element of colonial jurisprudence in the way that the government in Darwin, it doesn't matter who's in power, target Aboriginal people as being antisocial in their opinion, when in Aboriginal point of view, they are behaving how they want to behave, and if that's perceived as being antisocial, well, for them it's cultural in terms of their social ontology.
Are there any more questions from the floor? Otherwise, I'll go to the last chat question. Questions here? The last one is from Neil Yana. Were there any gender-related aspects of the resistance? Did any gender-related aspects stand out?
Certainly gender-related. So in the colonial period after invasion, the first decades, we see a decline in the birth of children. We see a decline in numbers of both genders. And we know this from the records that were kept by colonial officials on an annual basis. There would be some kind of activity like blanket distribution. And, the officials would take care of how many adult males, females, children, babies. And over time, they noticed that Aboriginal people were becoming more and more sick and ill with the diseases that colonisation brought with it, but that women were giving birth to children less, and there were less children in the population over time in the first few decades after the invasion, excuse me. In the long grass, gender again is, it's a different, it figures differently. There are men and women in the long grass camps in Darwin, and the experience of being a woman in the long grass, which is just anecdotal evidence, comes from women who spoke to me when they were home if I arrived at a long grass camp, and I told them about the study, what I was interested in, why I wanted to do it, you know, did they want to talk about anything, share any stories with me. And there was, like I say, anecdotal evidence there that life in the long grass for women is much tougher than it is for men in the long grass. Although it's not, well, I don't read the NT News anymore, but when I did used to read the NT News, I didn't really notice that there were a lot of stories about the prevalence of violence in the long grass, and it's a very violent place. After dark, it's extremely violent, and women bear the brunt of a lot of that violence.
Okay, thanks, Kellie. Well, we're going to move to morning tea, but before we do, can I just get us to thank Kellie once again for this incredibly compelling, and I think it's such carefully argued. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all of you for turning up today in the room and also online. It's been a wonderful audience, great questions. I'm sorry that people online can't join us for morning tea, but all of you can. So thank you.